Good evening. Everyone can hear me pretty well? All right. So thank you all for coming. Tonight is the fifth concert in the Mary Quick Jones concert series. Just a brief little bit about this concert series. This concert series is free, open for anyone, so feel free always to invite friends and family. Anyone is welcome here. There is no obligation to make donations. You can just come and enjoy the music if you want to. I set up this concert series in honor of my grandmother. And each concert, I choose a different charitable cause to make donation to, and sometimes I feature guest performers. I'm going to talk a little bit about tonight's cause. It was a little bit extra research and preparation for this than normally I've had in the past, so I want to talk at length a little bit about it. But there's plenty of information you can read in your program. If you want to donate, there is a basket in the back, or you can scan the QR code in the program. If you are in the live stream tonight, there is a link in the description. You can go there. This will take you to Rio Rancho Presbyterian Church's donation page. They process the donations, so if you want to make a donation, just make, say, MQJ or Mary Quick Jones to indicate where you want your donation to go. So I wanted to make something to help citizens of East Palestine, Ohio. You may remember this from a year ago in February. There was a major train disaster in this place, a large derailment, and then later a chemical disaster that occurred because there was many tanker cars full of chemicals on this train. And since this event, it was covered quite extensively at the time, but then as many things go, it sort of slipped away into the background and it never gets talked about. But it definitely is not a situation that ever ended. It happened a year ago, but the impacts are ongoing. And we really honestly still don't have a full reckoning yet of what the consequences of what this will be and how many people will ultimately be affected. But I'm hoping to raise a little bit of awareness about what's been going on there. And I had some trouble. I really wanted to make sure that the donation got directly to people there, people who live in this area. There's so much where it goes to a nonprofit organization, and then it doesn't ultimately end up getting where it needs to go. And so I looked a lot into research trying to find something local, something on the ground there. It was very difficult to come across just doing research. I had to resort to making phone calls and talking directly to people. And so over the last few weeks, I've been kind of calling around some different places. And finally, I was able to get in touch with some people there who helped me point in the right direction of where this aid money could go. So ultimately, what I've decided to do is to donate to a place called the Way Station. The Way Station has been in this area for a number of decades. They've been around about 35 years, I believe. And this is one of a few on-the-ground local organizations there, and it was the only one with a website. So this was part of the decision that came. There were a couple others, but they are very local, and they don't really have any out-of-the-community ways to find out about their operations. Let me give you a little bit more about sort of what occurred on this day. It was a large derailment. Over 51 cars were involved in the derailment. 11 of those were chemical tanker cars. So these chemical tanker cars, I don't want to make this into a chemistry lesson, but I have to give just a little bit of information to try to give scale of what has happened here. So probably most prominently, we heard about the release of vinyl chloride. Vinyl chloride is a highly flammable gas that's used in the production of PVC. If you know, PVC is used in our piping, in a lot of water piping, various other applications. And in its solid plastic form, it is non-toxic, but in its gaseous form, it's highly toxic. And among the vinyl chloride released, it was 129,000 gallons of vinyl chloride, which is one of the largest releases of vinyl chloride in history. There's only a few other events that are similar in terms of their scope. Some other chemicals, benzene, 60,000 gallons, butyl acicrate, 30,000 gallons, isobutylene, 30,000 gallons, ethyl acetate, 30,000 gallons, and 2-butox ethanol, 30,000 gallons. All of these chemicals are highly toxic, and many of them have different effects depending on their form. Some of them were in gaseous form in the tankers, and others were in liquid form. I want to give a little bit of timeline of what happened for those who maybe don't remember any of the details of this. So the derailment occurred on February 3rd in the evening, and for a few days, these tankers were, it was on a low-level fire that was going, and the chemicals were leaching into the soil and into the water supply. An evacuation order was finally issued on the 6th, a few days later. It was for a small zone, a 1 by 2 mile radius, which is really nothing when you think about the way that air and water moves across long distances. This is a very narrow zone for evacuation. On that night, they did what they referred to as a controlled burn. This terminology, I think, is very euphemistic. What they really did was they detonated it. They used explosives to blow up the tankers, and all of the chemicals that were inside were burned off into the atmosphere. And this was done to clear the tracks so that Norfolk Southern, the rail company, could proceed with business as usual to move more train cars through this area. The evacuation order was lifted on the 9th, and then you have some residents returning to the area. Norfolk Southern resumed rail traffic on the evening of the 8th. So when residents came back to their homes, there was already traffic moving again through the town. The debris was still scattered to the sides of the rail. They hadn't gotten fully through the cleanup process yet, but yet there was still movement of trains back through the area. I have one other little bit of information that I want to include about this, specifically on vinyl chloride. So we have a system of classification for carcinogenic substances that goes through a UN agency called IARC, International Agency for Research on Cancer. And they classify carcinogens into 4 groups, Group 1, Group 2A, Group 2B, and Group 3. And I just want to give you some examples from each of these so that you can maybe give some comparison and get a reference of just how toxic and dangerous vinyl chloride can be. So in Group 3, this is probably not carcinogenic. This is substances that has some evidence that it may cause cancer in both humans and animals, but there's insufficient evidence in either of these categories, nor good evidence that shows that the mechanism in experimental animals transfers the same way to humans. So some examples of things in this category are caffeine and fluoride, which we know is used to treat our water. Group 2B, this is possible carcinogens. This is where there's sufficient research, particularly with regards to animals, but not as much transfer over to showing how this affects human subjects. Some things that you'll find here are aspartame, which is an artificial sweetener we use in sugar-free gums and sugar-free sodas, things like this. Also, citrus red number 2, which we use to color orange peels so that we get a more vibrant color in the grocery store. Group 2B, these are probable carcinogens. This is where there's a large body of research, particularly sufficient in animals, but a limited amount for human study, where more needs to be done. As with many things in science, you have an idea, but it's only suggested at by what the body of evidence you have, and it's hard to come to a guaranteed conclusion. And so some of these possible carcinogens in Group 2A include things like glyphosate, which is used as you might know it as Roundup. It's a weed killer, and it's used extensively in our agricultural production all over the United States. And then there's Group 1, which is carcinogens that we have basics close as you can to scientific certainty that they cause cancer in humans. This is things like asbestos, plutonium, and also vinyl chloride. I think I will leave it there. There's more to read about in your program. If you want to know, there's some links in there. There is a link that takes you to Toxic Free Future. They have some good reporting and the study on the effects of transportation and production of vinyl chloride, something to consider. There's also another research group at the University of California, San Diego, the Golom Research Group. We have recently seen some results from the research, some of the research this group has done. They were involved in the research that connected cancer rates to toxic burn pits that were used in Iraq and Afghanistan. And this past year, there was finally some resolution in Congress to get some help for veterans who were impacted during their time in Iraq and Afghanistan from these toxic burn pits. And the same research group is now funding a study into this area in East Palestine. Speaking to the residents, this was one of the first things that they tried to make clear to me, was that one of the biggest problems is just the lack of testing. People can't afford to have their water tested. There is not extensive community-wide testing. The city tests the municipal water supply every 2 weeks, and this is about it. And so there's a lot of people who are suffering health consequences, but they don't have the studies, the data to prove it. And this is something that is going to, I think, be a part of this moving forward, trying to fight to prove that actually these health consequences our community is experiencing is directly linked to this event. Okay, I'm going to move on. I want to talk about the music a little bit. These two pieces, I'm going to play two sonatas tonight. The first one is Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. This title, Moonlight Sonata, is a title that was put to the sonata later on, actually after Beethoven had already died, so he never referred to it in this way. Beethoven called this sonata quasi una fantasia, which is somewhat like a fantasia. A fantasia is a free-form piece of music that has little structured elements, and rather it goes sort of in a free way and changes through different ideas and material. Typically sonatas, especially in this era, this late classical period of Beethoven, sonatas were highly structured pieces. It's very similar to symphonies, but for solo instruments, for piano. And so they have very set ways each movement is to be structured. The Moonlight Sonata eschews a lot of this. Its first movement is completely free. It has no clear structure. It moves directly from its beginning material to the end without any sort of separated sections in between. Highly unusual for the first movement of a sonata. The second movement is what we call a minuet and trio. So it has two sections and they interrelate. You begin with the minuet, then the trio, and then a return to the minuet. This is a more typical structure you see for second movements. And then finally, the third movement is very exciting, and its structure is actually quite similar to what we see in first movement sonatas. It has an exposition, a beginning section, and then it repeats the exposition, and then it goes on to what we call the development, where the material is modified and changed, goes through different keys, and sort of comes out transformed on the other side, and then finally the recapitulation, the return of the original material, and the conclusion. So I'm going to take a brief intermission after my first sonata so I can rest and prepare for my second one. I'll give you some notes on the Chopin sonata after this, this intermission. So without further ado, the Moonlight Sonata. Okay, so the next piece on the program is a sonata by Chopin. He wrote 3 sonatas. This one was very early in his career. He was an incredibly young man. I did a little bit of research trying to find he was maybe 22, 21 years old when he wrote this piece. His other 2 sonatas come later on in his career. A little bit of fun fact about this sonata. If anyone is familiar with the Chopin competition, this happens an annual competition in Poland, and it's a multiple round competition where you play various pieces from Chopin's repertoire. It's a notoriously difficult competition to participate in because there are many rounds and every round is full of exhausting, difficult pieces. For the sonata round, which is I believe the 3rd round, you're not allowed to choose the sonata. I don't really know why. It's certainly difficult enough. I think in part it's because this sonata was not very well received when it was first premiered. To understand why that is I think a little bit difficult. I'm sure you listen to it, you will enjoy it, but I think, and I've given a lot of thought to this, why it might have not been so well received. I think in part it is heavy use of chromaticism, which is when you have not notes in a key, but rather every single note, right? And this he uses extensively throughout this piece. And we see chromaticism pretty regularly in later 19th century, early 20th century music. But at this time, it was less common, and I think it is maybe considered a little bit, little gauche, the way he applies it throughout the piece. And so maybe to the ears at the time, it was not so nicely harmonized. But for me, I personally really enjoy the use of chromaticism in the piece. Another fun fact about this piece, the first time that I ever encountered it, I was a senior in high school, and I was looking to audition at schools. I hadn't decided where I wanted to go yet, and there were a number of schools on my radar. And some of these schools had very extensive audition repertoire you needed to prepare. And so I started to look into this and began preparing some repertoire. And one of the requirements was I needed a sonata by Chopin, Liszt, or Brahms. And I happened to settle on this one, number 1 sonata. And I will just say I'm glad I didn't play it then because it was far beyond my ability. It's really still pushing at my ability today. But it is a very interesting piece. The first movement, traditional sonata structure, it is very beautiful the way that the theme is woven and transformed. He moves it in all voices, in the high voice and the low voice, in between, flipping it around. He really goes to the full extent you could possibly do in transforming this small amount of musical material he begins with. The second movement is a minuet and trio. The minuet is very light and fun. The trio, very beautiful. They go well, nice together. The third movement, Larghetto, my favorite of this sonata, one of my favorite slow movements in any of piano sonata repertoire. You'll hear extensive use of what we call polyrhythm, which is where you have one rhythm and then another rhythm that doesn't divide evenly against that other rhythm. So for example, 2 against 3, or 3 against 5, something like this. And polyrhythm is one of Chopin's favorite techniques. He uses it in all manner of his compositions. He likes to do it, I think, in part because it provides for very virtuosic passages where he can take a simple theme, but then add many extra notes to it. But also, I think he just really liked the tension that it creates between one rhythm that is doing something and then another rhythm that is pulling in another direction. So you will hear quite a lot of this in the Larghetto movement, and I find it to be just absolutely gorgeous. The final movement, the Presto finale, is another very exciting piece. You may see some similarities to the final movement from the Moonlight Sonata. Beethoven was a huge inspiration for Chopin, one of his most important compositional sources that he draws from. And so in these early works, you see a lot of Beethoven bleed through in his writing style. As with many people, artists emulate the artists that came before them. So maybe, and that is part of why it is also not considered to be in the Chopin competition. It is not as advanced in terms of his musical compositional thinking as you see with his later sonatas, but I think that has nothing to do with diminishing its overall quality. So I hope you enjoy Chopin's Sonata Number 1. Thank you again, everyone, for coming out tonight. I hope you enjoyed the music. If you would like to leave a donation, there's the basket in the back. One thing I want to make a note of, if you flip to your back program, you see that my next guest performer, Aaron Carlson, he is a friend of mine who works at the Albuquerque Institute of Music, wonderful violin player. Our concert date will be a little bit different than we normally have. We've been doing Saturdays at 5 o'clock. This one will be on a Sunday at 5 o'clock. Aaron is Jewish, and he celebrates Shabbat with his family, his child, and his wife, and he asked me if I could choose another day for the concert. I told him, of course. So Sunday, 5 o'clock, April 21st, you won't want to miss it. It's going to be an excellent concert. We have all manner of very interesting composers, some new composers you've never heard before, and also some that you probably have heard before. So, all right, have a good night. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Yes, I hope you enjoyed it.